Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by
the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and its member A2H, engineers, architects, and planners, creating an enhanced quality of life for our clients and community. To learn more about A2H's services and markets, visit a2h.com.
the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Crime in the community and the efforts to reduce it tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Pastor Keith Norman from the First Baptist Church on Broad. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Josh Spickler is Executive Director of Just City. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Harold Collins with Operation Safe Community. Thanks for being back.
Thanks for having me.
And Bill Dries, Senior Reporter with the Memphis Daily News. So there has been a rise in crime. It's been in the news. We'll talk maybe a little bit about some of the specific incidents that have gotten some headlines, but maybe a bigger picture conversation about what's going on. And I thought I'd start with a general question of what from each of your seats, from each of your perspectives, what is responsible for this uptick in the violent crimes? Certain violent crimes are down, but certainly the murder rates basically doubled compared to last year. Certain other crimes are. Harold Collins, your take on what's going on?
Well, I consider it to be, number one, we are a part of a larger group of cities, major urban cities across the country who are seeing an uptick in homicides. The FBI director, Comey, came to Memphis a couple of weeks ago to share that information with some of us. But more importantly, I see it as a perfect storm in Memphis, where we have seen a reduction in law enforcement personnel across the city. We continue to see young African American men who are underemployed or unemployable. They see family members and friends who seem to can't get ahead in life, even with a high school diploma or some other form of formal education. They seem to take 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And when you put all of that together, you get this angry sense of desperation and despair. And so we have a group of people in our community, particularly African American men, who feel they're not getting ahead in life. And so what they do is lash out with anger. They see violence on the streets, in their homes, in their communities. And that's the only way they know how to articulate their frustration and get ahead in life.
Yeah. Keith Norman, your take.
Some of those things I would obviously agree with, but have to disagree with, in the sense of that being the only way. And I wouldn't want to polarize the issue as well, to where we recognize that there are crimes that are taking place in the African American community. We have to look at the full spectrum of why crimes occur. Lawmakers and the unintended consequences of things that have happened in our community, I believe, have a responsibility as well. When we look at how juveniles have been dealt with in Shelby County, where we have a record to prove that we've dealt with juvenile crime in one community different than we've dealt with juvenile crime in another community, we have created some of the records and some of the hurdles for these African American males that we have not created for others whom committed some of the same crimes. There's proof to go back and look at that when we look at the Shelby County Juvenile Court and how it has performed over the years. And so we have to look at the full system, and I think we have to be very honest and transparent and say that both ends of the spectrum are responsible. When we look at the amount of guns that are on our street that are illegal, I'm not talking about legal guns, but illegal guns on our streets, we also have to look at the distribution factor. One of the most eye-opening days of my life in most recent history has been standing at a protest with the people at the Darius Stewart protest while another young man was shot and killed at LA Fitness. And while I was leaving that place, headed to LA Fitness to see what was going on, because I got a phone call, I drove past 3 signs at various shops that were not gun shops in our community, but they had signs out in the front of their stores saying gun sale. And so the access to guns and the ease by which they enter our community and the distribution factor, we have to look at that as well and not just blame the people who are caught up in these systems.
And Josh, your group works on some of the things that Pastor Norman just brought up in terms of, what some of the tough on crime laws that were passed, maybe with good intention, to throw people away, the 3 strikes and you're out, some of these sentencing guidelines and so on. Talk about some of those things and the impact they've had and some of the ones that you all would like to change that maybe even are counterintuitive to people. For instance, the bail issue of how expensive it is for bail and reducing that cost, and some of those things that counterintuitively for some people actually you think and other people think will help reduce crime.
Sure, and it's counterintuitive in a way, but it's proven now in states across the country that we can shrink our criminal justice system, we can shrink our prison populations, and we can become safer communities. I mean, crime's going down across the country and has been for several years now. At the same time, prison populations and jail populations are going down, because what we know is when we put people in that environment, in those institutions, the chances of them coming back skyrocket. Recidivism is very high in this state, and it's high across the country, because what's happening in our prisons and jails is not rehabilitation as we say in the law that it should be. And so at Just City, we're trying to, number one, keep people from ever taking that first step into prison because of the recidivism problem and the lack of opportunity once they're there. And we do that with, we think, bail reform. And then once someone comes out of that criminal justice system, it's very difficult to get back into the mainstream economy. And so we've done a lot of work around expungements and clearing people's records and trying to get them back to work.
Before I go to Bill, the bail reform one is fascinating to me. So if for a you're going to do this right, and I'm going to do it wrong. But for a misdemeanor or for a small offense and the bail is set at $500, most people, I think I read on your site or heard you talking about, a lot of them can't pay the $500, so they end up spending, 5, 6, 7 days in the Shelby County Jail.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, and so this is
for a small offense.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not talking about murders. We're
Right.
not talking about
Right.
violent crime
Right.
here, right? I mean, they're in jail for 6 days
correct.
because they can't get bail.
A lot of the people, most of the people in the Shelby County Jail, it should be said, are there for violent crimes, awaiting trial, and their bail is high, and that's for protection, that's to ensure that their appearance, and that's the purpose, supposedly, of bail. But there is a segment of people in that jail on low bonds, for $500 for instance, who are there only because they don't have the means to make that bond. And the difference, the track that they take versus the track that, say, I would take if I were in that jail, someone would bail me out almost immediately. And I would have opportunity to meet with my attorney and go to court kind of on my timetable and present my case and prepare my case. The person in jail, all they want to do is get out. And so often they're faced with a choice. Well, you can get out after these 3 days and plead guilty and go home. And that is the choice that they take because they want to go home.
But and then, does that just kind of set them up, and then I'll go to Bill, does that just set them up, Harold, I saw you nodding your head, for more trips to the jail?
Absolutely it does, because once you plead guilty, you got fines and you got court costs. And particularly in Memphis, because you don't have a livable wage job, after a certain amount of time, there's a warrant issued for your arrest because you hadn't paid your court costs and your fines. So guess what? You get rearrested.
Right.
And then you spend another 5 or 6 days in jail on a $500 fine, because the more times you come to jail, the more likely your bond is going to be increased. That's the method.
It's a snowball.
And so it's a revolving door.
But let's give an example of how this might have started. Because again, I said it wasn't violent crime, so it might have started with what?
Driving while license revoked.
License revoked, exactly. And then overwhelmingly, let's go back to the juvenile justice system. Department of Justice recently released report shows that young African American men were encouraged overwhelmingly to plead guilty or to take a plea. And so when this time, and this is their only option that's presented to them. This is the option that's before you. This is the way out. Mom or dad doesn't have the money to get a lawyer or to get a bail set at this point, or even a young person in the system, 18 and above. This is the first step. A traffic ticket is the first entry into the the justice system.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole process.
Bill.
So, is the system on automatic pilot? I mean, is that what we're talking about? Because I hear discussions at the higher levels all the time about, we're proposing this bill that deals with harsher punishments for gang members, for violent criminals, but we're not talking about nonviolent offenders. But from the comments that we've just had, you're not necessarily dealing with two different groups of defendants. You're dealing with someone who may be further into the criminal justice
Absolutely.
system than they were when they were a nonviolent offender who maybe started out that way.
Absolutely, Bill. What you find is, again, in our community, overwhelmingly, you have individuals who drive without license being revoked, and there are hundreds of laws now on the books that will disqualify you from driving, from paternity to probation fees to points, a 12-point system in our state. So if you get all of these combined, your license is revoked. You have a job that's a technicolor, and you don't have transportation because the bus system doesn't get you there. So you take the risk to drive. You drive, you get stopped because your tail light is out, you make an illegal right turn. They stop you, police will arrest you, you get cited for driving while license revoked, second offense. Your bond is initially $250 on the first, $500 on the second. Mm-hmm. So then you can't get out of jail. That's what Josh is talking about. And on top of that, when you get out, they place you on probation for 11 months and 29 days. So you have probation fees, court costs, and fines. And you don't have a job. And so the probation company is gonna violate you because you didn't pay the probation fee. The court is gonna violate you because you didn't pay the court costs. So you get rearrested. And then guess what? It revolves all over again. And so that's what is typical going on in Shelby County.
Let me fill the gap between the two of these guys. And what further complicates the problem is that the places or the points of access where the young people could have gone to get the driver's license, or the opportunity to go online in some states where they actually have it, where you can complete most of these processes, are often overcrowded, are often not in our communities. They've been shut down in certain places where young men and young women did have access. And so you have a poor transportation system. You need to get a driver's license to go to work, or you need to get the proper paperwork. What do? You can't get there. You don't have the means to do it. You can't go online to get it. You can't get it in your community. These are the unintended consequences sometimes that keep people caught up in the systems that end up leading them into the prison system that they're trying to fight to get out of.
Yeah.
I think
Josh.
the point I want to make is that these are state laws, that these are laws that we've been making in the state of Tennessee, in Nashville for 40 years, just like we have in many states across the country. And I love Bill's term autopilot, because that's exactly what's happened, is that we began to react to things that we were afraid of in the early 80s, and those were crack babies, and those were super predators, children who were going to rise up and be like criminals we've never seen before, and both of those things turned out to be not true. Our response to them was 3 strikes and you're out, was stiffer penalties for drug offenses, was stiffer penalties for violent crimes. And so what we have in Tennessee is autopilot, is that we're still reacting to things like a spike in crime with these solutions that are not solutions at all. And what stopped it in other states is that they finally got tired of spending money to house people, which is the most expensive thing that government does. And in Tennessee, our corrections budget is $1 billion at the state level. That doesn't include local jails and correction centers like Shelby County. So $1 billion in the state is being spent to house people, and we continue this past legislative session to enhance punishments and lengthen sentences when states like Texas have closed prisons. States like Florida have turned prisons into reentry centers. And when they do that, when they shave a little money off of that and put it to reentry and put it to programs like we've been talking about, their recidivism levels go down, their prison populations go down, their savings go up. And so we have to get off of autopilot, and I think we're getting there in Tennessee because we're realizing how expensive this is, but we didn't take the steps this time around to turn off autopilot.
So when we have more than 90 homicides and we're not even halfway through the year, what do we do about that? Because we obviously have to deal with that, and we can't wait for a longer, we can't fix everything on the way to dealing with that.
Sure. And in my opinion, a couple of things. I mean, again, I think these are crimes of reaction. These are reactionary crimes. These are young men who we know have not developed, and they don't finish developing until they're almost to their 30s. And they're faced with a situation that they're not trained to deal with. And where we see things that work in places like Chicago, which is another violent city seeing a spike right now, is things like cognitive behavioral therapy, teaching people to make decisions in a different way, not automatically, but to slow their thinking down. So that kind of thing can work fairly quickly. The thing that's more long-term, and Pastor Norman mentioned it a second ago, is the availability of handguns. In large cities with poverty like Memphis, you cannot have the availability of handguns that we have. And in places where they tighten up as much as they can, as much as the state and federal government will let them, we see drops in handgun crimes. So this is handgun violence and gun violence, and I think we should call it that, and not just violence and not just homicide. This is gun violence and gun murder.
Your take, I mean, getting away from, not that it isn't important, but the violent crime, the homicide rate. I mean, what can be done? You know, people listening, people who turn on the news, they want something done tomorrow.
Well, I think what we need to do is, like Josh said, is figure out a way to reduce the number of guns in our community. And the key term is illegal guns.
Correct.
Now, you know, our state now has made it possible for you to have a gun at almost any situation. But there might be some opportunities where we could ask our state legislators to come up with laws that specifically target those guns that are stolen. If the gun is stolen, then you have to immediately report that gun to the police. You have to report the fact that it was stolen. And if it's not reported and used in a particular crime, then there should be consequences. I think good gun owners would do those kinds of things.
Right.
And so what we do is put the onus on legislators who promote gun safety and gun laws, and then utilize their wording, I don't want to use the word rhetoric, but use their terms for such that good gun owners would do these kinds of things. And so if you do that, then we can reduce it.
And you're again to that question of the person who's listening who says, great, there are too many guns, I agree, and the justice system is messed up, but I want to feel safer tomorrow.
I think we're leaving a big piece out when we leave our school system out. We've cut so much away from it that the kids are coming out without mediation skills, without the ability to solve problems, without the ability to talk through things and just simply say there is another way. The immediate reaction is always violence. And when that is the first response, or when that is the immediate response, that's where we have a problem. I think we go back to community as well. One of the things that I am a proponent of is how do we use the model of data-driven policing with community policing. I'm not for data-driven without community policing, because people know people, and when I know the police officer that's in my community, or if I have a relationship with the precinct or the people who are there, I'm more likely to talk to them. We get phone calls at our church all day about people who don't feel safe, but they're willing to say this: Pastor Norman, I want to tell you, but I'm afraid to talk to the police, because if they come to my door and take a report, the bad guys know where I am now. And so we often serve as an intermediary in between our police and people in our community, and not just in our immediate community, but in an expanded area. So I think it's important to involve community and get back to the sense of us feeling connected.
Your take on the policing issue, and it's been a big issue because the police force went from 2,400 down to 2,000. There was some from Blue Crush, which is data-driven, some reintroduction of community policing, and now we have a new administration. What is Jim Strickland going to do? He said he wants to get back to 2,400, and he wants to do community policing and Blue Crush. What works and what doesn't? I mean, is it about throwing cops at the problem?
I think absolutely it's not about that. I think it's about how we police and not how many police we have, because the crimes that we're talking about, again, and I hate to continue on this point, are crimes that occur spontaneously. And the same with domestic violence, which is another big problem in this community. These are crimes that are occurring in homes. We can't all have a police officer standing over our shoulder at every moment. And that's about the only thing that would work in terms of the number of police officers. But the way we police, and it's important, I think, from Just City's perspective and from my perspective, we're not anti-cop. No. We're not anti-police. These guys are doing incredible work. I went on a ride-along last year, actually, and it ultimately changed my perspective on all of this. These guys are on the tip of a spear, and their heads are on swivels constantly, and we're asking them to do a job to reduce homicide, to reduce domestic violence. That's impossible for one police officer, for a squadron of police officers, for a precinct of police officers to do. And so getting them in touch with their neighborhoods, and that's what I saw, because this was a community policing officer that I rode with, was the people knew him.
Right.
And that's the kind of thing. They have to trust, and they have to know the communities they're policing, and they have to be embedded in those communities. And that's the kind of thing I think that works.
Before I go back to Bill, just I'll put you on the spot. What is the rate of, with murders and violent crime? It's people who know each other, right?
Absolutely.
I mean that's what's
Almost always.
Almost always. So there's this fear of violent crime and the randomness. And I'm not saying that it's somehow less tragic or less sad or less awful when it's two people who know each other, but it's a whole different perspective than a sense of there is a random gunman at any corner who might shoot.
That's correct. That's correct. But it does generate fear. These headlines and these stories, it happening on streets that I drive downtown Memphis, for instance, the most recent. And it drives fear, and it drives, again, our instinct to treat this with a blunt object, with more police, with more cameras, with more guns on our police officers. And that, I don't think, is the solution. We have to be careful not to be afraid, because what we see with these victims is that they're and their families, they're not getting the justice that you and I would get. They're not getting the protection. The victims of this are disproportionately minorities as well. And so we're not giving them access to a justice system that is providing any sort of healing or any sort of justice for the families who are losing loved ones. But you and I are generally safe. You're right.
Yeah. Bill.
So when this wave of violence that we're seeing right now subsides, and it will at some point, do we lose the political will? Do we lose the political urgency to continue exploring solutions? Because I mean, I think we've all seen this happen before. The individual details are unique. Every life lost is unique. But we've seen these spikes before, and we've seen them go down for reasons that are as elusive as the reason that they arose in the first place. And then people stop talking about the things we're talking about around this table.
Let me respond to that from this perspective. Political will cannot be isolated in one silo of our government. This can't be the mayor alone. This has to be the mayor, the city council, the county commission, the county mayor. It has to be a collective problem. We're talking about Memphis, but Memphis sits within Shelby County. And so if Mayor Strickland is the only voice that's out there trying to champion this cause, and we're trying to pin it on Interim Director Rawlins to say, you two guys fix it, we're chipping at it. We're not trying to really knock it out. We need to bring together this entire community. We must bring together the top law enforcement officer in Shelby County, which is the sheriff by election, and we must bring the county mayor into this conversation as well. We must bring all resources to bear. We're in an epidemic stage. We keep talking about it, the highest crime rate, we're leading the nation, but if we're singing solos rather than singing as a choir, our voice is not loud enough and strong enough.
Okay, Operation Safe Community is that coalition of leaders. What are the discussions like at that level? Does everybody around the table agree on this, or do people disagree?
No, here's what we all agree, that Operation Safe Community 3, for example, is going to be driven by community engagement. We recognized in 1 and 2 that we didn't have the participation from the community that we needed to make this a reality. This particular process, we're going to engage community. That's why Pastor Norman talked about it can't be just the elected officials or the appointed officials. In order for this to really, really change, the community has to be engaged, and they have to have ownership of it. That's why Josh talked about police officers have to know who they are. But in order to do that, and I'm glad you mentioned, they are in a different spirit because they run from call to call to call to call. And so it's hard to community police, so to speak, when you have this kind of running going on. And so what we have to do as a community is say, this is what we want to do, this is what we want to engage in, and this is what we want to fund. See, we all missing the boat here. We're not talking about the huge quote unquote elephant in the room, and that's money. In order to change some of the dynamics, the thinking, the cognitive behaviors, the engagement of community, we have to redirect some funding that goes to other areas that people consider to be pertinent. And that's the political will. So when the crime goes up and it subsides, then we have to say as leaders, well, maybe we should invest a little bit in community centers more to get programming for young folk, to get directors of programs in all these places such that it now becomes collaboratively done versus silo-driven.
Your sense, is there the political will? There's just a couple minutes left here.
Sure.
Do you talk to a lot of political leaders? Do you try to talk to them if they'll listen to you? Is there political will to stay on some of these bigger, long-term solutions, as Bill said, or do they just want to get through this wave and move on to other issues?
Well, I think we're seeing the beginning of a change in that because it is so expensive, as I said earlier, and also because violent crime gets the headlines, and violent crime damages families and communities and makes us all uneasy, and it's difficult. But what we have at the end of all of this, at the other end of all of this, are non-violent crimes and a huge population that's had contact with the criminal justice system, making employment very difficult, making housing very difficult, student loans very difficult. And these are things that are also economic, and that does get attention, and that can generate political will. And when I think we realize that as a city that we are setting ourselves an artificial floor of employment, unemployment that is going to be with us because of how we use the criminal justice system. And that kind of thing is going to continue. Rise and falls of violent crimes will happen, but we have a community that we can't put to work because of the burden of the criminal justice system, and that's costing us in ways that we don't even know right now. And so I think we're beginning to see politicians and lawmakers understand that better.
Just in 30 seconds left, if the legislature could do 1, 2, 3 things, what would they do?
Well, I think
because a lot of it comes from the state.
Sure. At Just City, we've done a lot of work around expungement. That's where we spent a lot of our energy this past
once
session.
you've served your time, get that record, get that out of the public record.
Give people a chance to get that off the record, and people who are only in touch with the system once or twice. Not everyone, and start there. And we've seen that work in other places.
All right. I didn't give you enough time for a big question. I'm sorry.
You.
Thank you all for being here. Enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.
Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the Bartlett Area Chamber of Commerce and its member A2H, engineers, architects, and planners, creating an enhanced quality of life for our clients and community. To learn more about A2H's services and markets, visit a2h.com.